I thought it'd be better to have people kind of come in a little relaxed than be a little on edge. My name is Mark Levant, and today we'll talk about change making in communities of faith. And I'll start with a little bit about myself. I'm currently an adjunct faculty around the area. I teach human sexuality courses. And I also have, I'm dissertating right now, so working on my dissertation here at Widener in the PhD program in human sexuality. And I'm focusing specifically on Catholic institutions of Catholic higher education, so colleges and universities, and what making change around sexuality looks like in those communities.
That's like so perfect. Sorry, I'm like super interested in that.
Thanks. Me too. Ask me again after 2 years if I'm still super into that, because I heard the dissertation's pretty intense. So anyways, that's currently what I do. And as a background, just to kind of get an idea of me and where I'm from, I grew up in Cleveland, and I did education in theology and pastoral ministry in the Christian world, specifically Catholic theology. Pastoral ministry is kind of like a theological social work. It's like doing the ministering part to people and then including God in that and their relationship to God. And secondary education. So I taught high school theology for a little while, and then I got a master's in theology, and I worked at a Catholic Student Center at Washington University in St. Louis. And so we'll talk a little bit about the intersecting identities there and what that looked like for me. And so I'll include examples of that as we go through, but probably not to start off. And so I entered Widener's program specifically sensitive to issues around faith. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So brief overview, because here at Widener, when you get your MED, they teach you, tell everyone where you're going, go there, and then tell them where you went. So that's what we're gonna do. So one of the things we're gonna do is define terms, because in PhD programs, they make you define everything. And so if people have said different things about what change making is, what communities of faith are, in history, in dialogue, in different cultures, all of which are great, we're gonna talk about them in the way that we are defining them in this room today. Then we'll go with some theoretical background, some things that are kind of important through theory, and why that's important to practice. Because a lot of the time when that's disconnected, there's a lot of things missed, and you're either too heady and you're not getting it, or then it's too fundamental and too narrowed in experience. So we're going to look at theory and the pros and cons and where it's adequate or inadequate. We're going to cover some important topics that you would behoove yourself to familiarize yourself with when working in communities of faith. And this is, we live in a particular Judeo-Christian society, and so there's a lot of values in Judaism and Christianity that permeate all of society. But this presentation is kind of designed to smooth out that peak of statistics and say, how can we access other people in other faiths and ways that we can be helpful to that. We'll talk about some barriers faced specifically by faith communities that you might not find in, secular, like higher ed, for example, different communities. And then we'll do an activity and we'll wrap up and we'll cover some, I'll let you know what we just did when we wrap up. So one note of awareness, and we're going to talk about identities and those advantages and limitations. So we just heard Feminista Jones talk about intersectionality, summed it up extremely well, and the way that that plays with us in this discussion is that we have some identities that serve us really well in some contexts, and then not so well in others. And so when it comes to faith, there are cultural backgrounds and familiarities that give some people an advantage over others. Being raised Muslim has a very, very, very different context and connotation than if someone were raised in a different faith and studied Islam and then began talking about changes in Islam and what that means to you and your family life and your cultural lifestyles. So we're going to keep that in mind. And this workshop is specifically designed with the concept of being very culturally competent around religion. Because there's, yes, the faith aspect and the doctrinal aspect, but there's also the cultural aspect that's very unique to each and every faith tradition. And if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask at any time, because we're actually going to be doing some group work, because as an educator from Widener, it's very important to kind of feel out what we call a formative assessment, your audience. We're going to talk about where you all are and types of communities that you've interacted with and that you have access to. So get yourself into some small groups, I don't know, 3, 4, whatever you feel like. And we're going to talk about the faith communities that you currently have access to in the future and in the past. So talk specifically about what faith traditions those are, and also if you've seen change in these communities and what that might have looked like. So go ahead and take the next 8 minutes to get into groups and talk about that amongst yourselves, and then we're going to come back to the larger group and share for some barometer readings. Go for it.
So excited.
So I guess I have access to them. I haven't gone to church in years. Like negative it was a Baptist church. Yeah. So, yeah, it was one of the Baptists. And the Baptists were any other denomination. Forget religion, but any other denomination definitely solid church. So, yeah. My dad was my story until barely. I like every soul, like ridiculous. All the stuff, but you know, right. Just tired of it. So like, they anymore. And like, I've been actually bad anything like I brought her perform to it. And then like very much identify as like I feel like it's sitting where it's my undergraduate in my high school the whole time. To remind me of where I all the stars this is like why they are what they are. Yeah, I mean so you were from what you described. Yeah, and I found that really social justice based. Yeah. I was raised in yeah, so I came here. Right? There's been a lot of changes. Or like I mean, they're the process of but about it was like 10 years ago at this point, though it doesn't feel that long ago. Like 10, 11 years ago, they came out with a new prayer book.
So I feel like
so for years and years and years and years,
I think that's like how it's changed.
all of the prayer books were under this like easy prayer title.
I don't know.
And so there was like two versions, each version, like each version had like different elements in it. And now they've totally like gotten another like system entirely. By bringing like they're now calling it which makes it feel like that Hebrew this kind of thing. And this year, they came out with a new high holiday version. Something like there had to went along the way. It's like prayer, and now there's. But it's really interesting looking at that. It's fascinating. But just the different traditions, the different interpretations of the scripture and religion, like religion itself is just fascinating. And so it's meant from best calls it the parable. It's not like prayer has 4 different options. There's the Hebrew, there's the transliteration, there's one translation, and then there's an interpretation. Versions of the same prayer. That's what I like. But it's you open
with like change in the community, I just feel like my family was
really, really tough friend. Like that's not cool to me. It's like to me, I'm like even I would say I'm Catholic. I don't know. That can be opposite
or a lot. Yes, and so I was really appreciating that with my mom, especially with my grandma being more Catholic than my mom is, and just with that. I think there's more like experience. Probably the right word. But maybe it's like definitely. I feel like there might be more that out there. So that's like less my grandmother is talking to like what like Tuesday about me or sex. I go home and they ask me questions. To say like, you know, and so just seeing that change around. Keep it up.
But take another 2 minutes.
I noticed that when I reached out, I guess kind of through Facebook, looking at progressive media, like in my world, there was no liberal thing. So if you were a liberal, that meant that you were, you were an atheist or whatever, you know, and so I learned more about what
I think that was the phrase that she said, like,
that there's, instead of just this very strict, narrow interpretation of how life is, there's all kinds of possibilities. It's just, like, we could all be wrong. You know, like no one is going to know.
So because I'm not still
on my argument is always like, by the example of others are not doing it. Why would we want yeah, they get caught up in like the people and the church, like the structure, and not the spirit of all. Christians are more like Pharisees. Like, it's just, you have to do this way or you're not, you know, godly. You think so? Yeah.
All right, go ahead and wrap up your conversations. We'll kind of bring it back to the larger group. So let's start with just the concept. What faith traditions do people have access to? What kind of faith traditions do you talk about? Come in? Judaism. Okay. Other ones? Anyone else have access to other non-Jewish faith traditions?
That's it. Just Judaism.
You Evangelical Christianity, Hinduism, great.
Catholicism.
Atheism,
Quakers.
Quakers, Catholicism,
Unitarian Universalists.
UUs, right, great. Jehovah's Witness, right.
I'll add that it's a very specific kind of Hinduism.
There's like a million different kinds of Hinduism.
Yeah, there's like a million. There's just a lot. Hinduism is very fluid, and so I have access to a particular kind and community, specific type of community, but not all at all.
And I think her saying that made me think about the flexibility, right? Because what you were saying about having access, I was reminded of how easy it is in my particular position, particular phase I have to kind of leave myself in and out of the community. Like if I'm in a city and there is a church that has a predominantly African American population, I don't have to know anybody. I don't have to be friends with somebody who will introduce me. I just need to show up and be like, hey. And then it's like, oh, welcome. You know.
Oh, now you're part of the community.
Right.
Right.
And so, but that's very different depending on, you know, if I were saying Muslim or, you know, a different.
Absolutely. And what kinds of changes did people see in these faith communities, or were there any?
Well, I don't know how to explain this, but like for me, I came from a very fundamentalist Baptist background. And then I started experiencing progressive Christianity, and it like just blew my world. And so it's just interesting to see more and more people coming from very fundamentalist backgrounds to progressive Christianity, whatever you define that as, and hearing their stories.
So sometimes having the same faith tradition and then approaching it differently, progressively or more conservatively, as is often dichotomized, right?
We talked about the new pope.
Oh yeah? In what ways?
I'm sorry. We talked about the new pope a little bit. So about how he's kind of challenging a lot of standards that have been set over the past few hundred years. Well, a few hundred, it's an understatement. But yeah, and how it might not be necessarily changing everyone who follows, but at least it's like starting the discourse about it.
My thought from, sorry, I tend to interject. My thought, like in regards to Catholicism, like I just find it so interesting that whatever the Pope does is what kind of filters down through. So it's hard to make change from the bottom, because even looking back at the last Pope, like he like redid all of the books and crap and like pulled old pieces back in, and then this Pope is pushing more forward. So it's just interesting how.
So especially watching change in these different communities. Tracy.
Well, I don't want to, if you're going to talk about that.
About Catholicism,
right? Like, maybe I'm not understanding it. Maybe it's how the new Pope is like talking about things, but it seems like it's very progressive. But when you look at the actual role, he's really not changing the role. You see? You know?
Yeah, so once again, that dichotomy of progressive and conservative and the way that others navigate that and the way that they view it. I just came from Dr. Zuleika Hepworth-Clark's decolonizing, and this is going to be one of those concepts that we'll weave into here, where actually instead of working from outside and decolonizing, we're going to talk about decolonizing from the institution first. Tracy.
I was just going to say, and it almost feels ironic because it almost feels like it's the opposite of this progressive, conservative progressive. I was talking about what I feel like has been the influence of capitalism in my religious experience, coming from churches that were very, relatively speaking, small and storefront to now being these huge, massive mega churches where like the pastor has this international ministry with books and tapes and all of these things, and thinking about the effect of that on not only the actual outreach that they're able to do to with individual parishioners,
right,
but also how that translates into very conservative ideology. So back in the day, you could say, well, excuse my language, but all fags are going to hell. And it was kind of like, well, we don't really mean that because if you left, we're not gonna have a church. But to being able to be sanctioned because you're getting all these dollars to now have this whole ministry that's about about homophobia and all of these things, and that being able to sustain it. Right. It's very troubling. But I see it's building, and people are becoming much more fundamentalist about things that 20 years ago they would talk about, but they wouldn't shame you out, like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, kind of speak on that is what I've seen with the Episcopal Church. They kind of, if I've understood correctly, it's like the main church is like, okay, we're cool with gay marriage, but if you're not, that's cool. Just be separate. So now there's these legal issues where I'm from because there's these big, gigantic, beautiful historical church buildings that. The church is like, no, this is ours, versus the higher church is like, no, this is ours. And there's this discrepancy. And so it's coming down to this, ultimate legal gain is making people dig their heels in about certain issues.
Right. So even in the finances, we see that change is possible, or what we perceive as change is possible in these faith communities. And so as I go on through this discussion, this presentation, I have a background specifically in a lot of really white Catholic change making. And so I might bring up examples from that, but that doesn't mean that this concept can't be translatable to other communities. Because the different faiths will talk about change differently. And we'll get into this momentarily. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to start with defining terms. There's not a lot, but there's some very important things that we're going to talk about. First and foremost, what are communities of faith? When people talk about communities of faith, people are like, oh, a religion. And then you have other religious studies scholars who are like, well, there's a difference between a faith and a religion. And then they're like, well, but then there's a difference between a faith, a religion, and then a denomination, which is true. There's a lot. Has anyone heard the word denomination before? Talking about different aspects, different sects, different arms, I guess you could say, of this particular faith tradition. And so the definition that we're going to go with is groups of organized individuals who are generally institutionalized, who join around a common theme of faith or religion. So this is going to be one of the things that people say, oh, hey, you believe these things? I believe these things too. And if they have a name for it, they'll call it that religion. If they don't, then it'll just be joining ideologies that bring them together. And so when we talk about these communities, that's what we're talking about, not specifically necessarily has to be a registered religion in any particular given state. And then, of course, what is change making? What we're talking about is, especially in communities of faith, offering a more useful method than the current one. And when you're talking about that with people and their faith, it's very, very, very important to say, in what are we affecting change? Because for people that you may have encountered who have extremely stringent faith beliefs and follow it a certain way, or follow it more symbolically. If you're changing someone's theology, or you're going to try and tell them that the history of their faith tradition is changed or different than they believe, you're going to be met with a lot of resistance. And so as people who are making change around sexuality, it's very important to clearly state what it is that changes. And that's going to be in part of the dialogue that you're going to have with if someone invites you in, like, hey, come and make change here. You're going to be like, okay, tell me about that, because you're going to be the person who has to explain to the faith community about that change. There was particularly when I worked at the Catholic Student Center, we had students at Washington University, but then we also had older adults that would come to the Catholic Student Center for Mass and stuff on the weekends. And we had a group called Queer and Spiritual, where, queer individuals get together, we'd all talk about things. And some of the older non-queer people in the community heard this and they were like, no, we can't call it that. That's really offensive. We need to call it gay and spiritual. And then all the gay people were like, well, all the queer people were like, and then all the straight white people were like, yep, absolutely, let's definitely do that. So there was a lot of education about, hey, like, hold on, everyone, let's talk about who we're limiting by you changing the name and not we changing the name. And so this is going to be something that is present in whether it's ministry to people, whether it's through the services that people have, the worship services, or the outreach that different faith communities have. So you want to be very clear about what it is you're affecting change in, and you'll probably want to steer clear of the I'm changing your theology or your religion, because people generally don't respond well to that. So then the basic paradigm, the theoretical background that we're kind of coming from here is about how the faith tradition views sex and sexuality. In what way do people relate to God and people relate to others? Because we have this concept of being people living in existence. Different theologies, different religions talk about that differently. And the ways that we do or should or shouldn't relate to people and relate to God. This is oftentimes called a theological anthropology or cosmological anthropology in the world of religious studies, because not all religions go with a theology or that of a god or gods. And so a cosmological anthropology is the same. How are we as embodied people to relate to each other in the world? And sexuality is going to be part of that, specifically. Sometimes they'll talk about it in this faith tradition, sometimes they won't. And so it's very important to understand, where are you coming from, faith people? Let me hear what your beliefs are. So as we move on to things that you need to familiarize yourself with, there's not only this concept, okay, how do you view this? Does anyone have examples of how different faith traditions view the way humans are and the way sexuality is? What is sexuality? What is sexuality for?
Procreation.
Procreation. Anything else?
God.
Gifts from God.
Tribute to God.
Mm-hmm. Tribute to God. Doing sexual things as a ritual. Mm-hmm.
Or something we do for you.
Mm-hmm. Could be a duty. Mm-hmm. Bond, emotional connection, or any connection, or sacramental connection, or cosmological connection, right? And there's all these different ways that people see it, and not all faith traditions agree on what that is, even in the same religion. So be aware of that when coming into it. Always ask those questions, being a good active listener. And so you'd want to familiarize yourself first and foremost with that power structure. Who is in charge in this faith community? Or what does power and the flow of power look like in this community? Because changing things in communities of faith can get really difficult when it comes from down here. And so you want to kind of find out what this structure is. Some people will ask, hey, so you've reached out to me. Tell me about the landscape here. What's going on here? Who's in charge? Sometimes the person at the top who gives you the okay is all right with things, but these people are not. And that will definitely affect the way that you design your intervention. Sometimes these people really need something. This person reached out to you, and the person up top is really not having it. And so you want to be careful about the way you go about discussing those things. Particularly in Catholicism, a lot of priests recognize that their congregants or the people in their parish need something around sexuality. And a lot of priests are really okay with giving that to them, but they can't. Because if it's found out that they ran a sexuality workshop or talked about how to have great sex with your spouse, and the bishop finds out, it can be problematic. And so other faith traditions take note of that power dynamic. Know who's in charge and know where you lie in that. And that's also going to be part of what your role is. Other things you want to familiarize yourself with is something we call a meta-narrative. Has anyone heard this word before? Speaking specifically of faith traditions. A meta-narrative is this concept of, where does your religion come from? What's the story. Some people have the story of creation that then made different faith movements, different religious leaders, and then moved into talking about all these different things. And there's a whole history associated with it. Know a little bit about that. Now, you don't have to know absolutely everything about the different aspects of Wiccan and the way that the faith has developed and the practices, but know a little bit, because this is going to be important to the way that people perceive where the change making is coming from. And so this entire community is drawing its roots from this larger concept. Do they interpret that story literally? Do they interpret that story symbolically? And if so, in what ways? Because that's going to help guide the way that we talk about sexuality. Another important thing is to familiarize yourself with the language used. Are there certain words or buzzwords that come around that have connotations? That things you want to steer clear of, things you don't want to say specifically. I once talked to a president of a university who says, okay, so now I'm going to this Catholic university, how do I talk about like LGBT people? And I was like, that's a fantastic question. I'm really glad you're asking. And I was like, what do you want to get at? He's like, well, I want to let everyone know that like they're really accepted and that we're going to be really progressive in the way that we talk to and minister to LGBT people. I said, okay, no. The word progressive, when you go to a Catholic university and they hear the word progressive, that means not what you're doing. And people are not going to respond well, specifically in the theological literature, in the dialogue with bishops. And so what Pope Francis has been doing, and the way that people talk about it in theology that does not necessarily turn people off, is you're shifting the focus to love and inclusivity than you are to what's bad, what's wrong. And if you say you're being more progressive, well, you're making a statement in that word. So in this faith community, there's lots of different things that have to do with the way people talk about sexuality and the relation. In Islam, there was, is anyone familiar with Sufi Islam? It's a branch of Islam that is the spiritual, and spiritual traditions in all of these faith traditions are usually more like, they're more guidelines than really rules. And so a lot of the spiritual writings are oftentimes throughout history deemed as heretical. They say, nope, bad. Actually, one fellow was put to death because he was like, oh, like I'm so in tune with everything, like I'm just with God, like I'm totally with God, I'm God. And then they're like, nope, dead. And you gotta be like, whoa, like hang on everyone. Let's talk about language and the way we're using it and what you mean. So being sure to clear that out with yourself and in your faith tradition or situation. And then, of course, there's always going to be barriers. Some of these things that we talked about are not even barriers. They're just things that you got to keep in mind. But sometimes you're going to encounter people having cognitive dissonance or believing one thing but then being shown that it's different. This can actually work to your advantage, specifically with groups of people who feel like their call is to actually love people and to see that what's happening is that their theology, their religion, or their own community is harming people is going to be a really good way to ask about that. Say, hey, what do you think your community does in these respects? Well, I talked to some people in the community, and here's how that's perceived. And there's a lot of people getting really hurt here. Is that something you'd like to address? Sometimes that's not always the case, but the cognitive dissonance is not always a bad thing, and it's not always we hit a wall and we're done, they got mad and kicked me out. Just keep in mind that there's always a different way of approaching that dissonance. And then the religiosity. Dissonance?
I was just going to ask, is that like the when people pose, well, what would Jesus do? Like if somebody's being super conservative, is that kind of like what it is, where it's like, that's your bottom line, so look at it.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance, yes. the what would Jesus do is pretty much, well, let's ask about that. And usually, when people are doing something particularly harmful and you ask them what Jesus would do, they then begin quoting different parts of scripture that have nothing to do with Jesus. So, but yeah, that cognitive dissonance is actually a spiritual tool that has been for millennia and across all traditions and all religious experiences. Cognitive dissonance has been some of the best learning tools throughout all of history. So the what would Jesus do is like the real quick, like, what would Jesus do? All right, I gotta go, you take care of that. Instead of kind of sitting and talking about the way that they incorporate Jesus into their life and the way that they think Jesus was and the way that Jesus would act and the types of things that what does love your neighbor actually mean? Because all of those are connected in a person's concept. And sometimes they don't make the really important connections to be like, oh, right, actually what I'm doing is not loving. I'm loving my neighbor, and I'm being Jesus-like. Oh, and is this person my neighbor? Yeah, but this person is actually getting harmed, and I live by this philosophy, so uh-oh. And so helping make those connections can be a really, really powerful thing for people, especially in the faith world. And then, importantly, that dialogue about motivations. Why do you need me to come to this community? Or if someone says, hey, this is your community, do something about it. Why, what needs to happen? Who's calling me? Why are we having all of these conversations? Because is something happening? Are people getting discriminated against? Were there some kids making out in a closet at one point? Were they maybe two boys? We have to talk about it. Or are people getting killed in your community? And we're figuring out how to respond to it as a faith community. Because all of those are going to impact the way that you go about this. And most importantly of all of these things is probably proceed with competence. Be aware of your role and the role that they expect you to fill. Sometimes that's the same. Sometimes it's not. And so there might be some compromise that has to go on. And in compromising, being competent in understanding where they're coming from, all those really good active listening things.
I'm sure maybe you'll touch on this in a second, but I'm thinking also, I'm curious about your thoughts on communities in which people already assume competence when there is none. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, we don't need to talk about this because the word says blah, 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 blah. So what's the issue?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So this is where that cognitive dissonance kind of comes into play, because you get to say, yeah, great, that's what the word says, awesome. And one of the things that I do is to talk about what a culture is and the way the dialogue happens across that. And specifically in Christianity, one of the things that I use, does anyone know of this concept of St. Paul? They talk about it in Catholicism, where the Pauline letters. Paul is called the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul is the exact concept of cross-cultural dialogue, bringing the Jewish concept of a Messiah into a Greek culture of a Christos, or a Christ. And there's actually a fellow who just died by the name of Flannery, who made this connection about, actually, when Paul did that cultural translation, people then were like, right, son of God, yeah, just like Zeus and Hercules. And he's like, no, like more metaphorically, more midrashic, more Jewish, but like not more Jewish because like you're Gentile, so yeah. And then so they got this concept of Jesus as son of God, when it's actually, that's not what was originally intended in Pauline literature, because Paul was being a good Jew, writing midrashic discussions about the relationship of Jesus to God and the world and the symbolism of what that means, and people ended up taking it literally. Anyways, so when it comes to that, I'm now getting up, but when it comes to this is what the word is, and we don't need to be culturally competent, part of it is, here's how we can help more people hear what you're trying to say. Because listening to others and getting to understand where they're coming from can help you have a dialogue with them about faith, and especially around sexuality. And so helping other people understand that can maybe help with that. Does that answer a little bit?
No, I think it does. I mean, I think there's still, I mean, it presents still a few more challenges, but not what you're saying is very clearly answered.
Okay. Do you have a question?
Sorry, just what's going on after the Son of God? Is that like where the whole Father, Son, Holy Spirit thing got all messed up?
Oh, yeah, we can talk more about the specific Christian doctrine afterwards. But yeah, that was a interesting. Sweetie, did you have something?
I think I just got a little lost. I think I interpreted Tracy's question differently than you did, and obviously that got resolved between us. So I'm a little bit. I assume maybe my question is interesting too. I don't know, but like the idea of you said when people assume competence where there is none, do you mean is the person who's being called to help, like to come in and do education, or did you mean like?
I think you can go both ways, right? So it can be where the person that's being called to be of service to the community has just as much of a jacked up thinking as the people in the congregation. But it can also be where the congregation decides, or the leadership of the congregation decides that there is no issue.
Right.
And to me, those both smack of lack of competence around the time.
So in the case where, so I thought the second thing you said was that was how I interpreted the question. And what came to my mind was that's a case of like leadership, like the little diagram you showed with the hierarchy, right? Like leadership being like there's nothing wrong here. Like obviously somebody called you or whatever, right? And somebody, so there would need to be some sort of like, well, why am I here then? Like what, well, so-and-so's, so-and-so's just out of mind, they don't know what they're talking about, they call you here, but then you have to have a conversation about the legitimacy of being there, right, at all. And convincing leadership, if that's decides whether you get to stay or not, you have to find a way in. So, I mean, that's what I started thinking about, is like, how do you go about that, right? But
I think about that, and I also think I think about the assumptions. Okay, so I've been approached to do sex education for teens. And it's not what you think, like, oh, come, you have free range. It's like, come tell them to stop doing blah, 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 blah. So for me, I feel like it's a competence issue too, because they lack competence in understanding what it actually means to provide a legitimate education.
Excellent segue.
All right.
Into, we're going to do a little activity around case studies specifically involving different scenarios like this, because that's a great question, and it's very, very situation dependent. Is who's doing what or saying what and why, and is it something we can work with or around or not, and kind of going with that. So if y'all want to get maybe back into your groups, I think we had 4 groups before, or if you want to get to different groups, that's great. I'm going to hand out some of these, and these are scenarios, and what we're going to do is, I don't trust that clock. Yeah. So for the next 5 to 6 minutes, we're going to go ahead and read through these, and then we're going to talk about them as a group, and then just address brief issues of how these look in practice.
I actually started thinking. I don't.
You're a specialty.
And then I don't really get it. Drinking out of the water.
But so essentially, the parents are concerned students are
like open,
period. I try to just go off of facts and not make any sort of judgment or take sort of I don't know if that would still be okay with parents, but
A local
so like invite. Yeah, exactly.
Like a physical, like what's happening to the body.
I would go kind of have, like, I pull the parents together and be like, we're gonna have a workshop. Here's what's actually going on, whether or not you want your kids to hear about this. And then from there, kind of establish my own credibility. And then be like, look, I'd love to do this with your team. I promise to not present any value.
Yes, right. Then,
Religion,
you need to
and then I'm gonna send them back to you for the values.
yeah. So that's the right.
Right. I think that's too often people assume that like, safe sex education is all about like saying that abstinence is bad. That is not an option. We're pretty open to anything you're comfortable with doing. We just want you to feel safe doing it.
Unless we also talk about another section about their touch restriction.
Yeah.
Behaviors, like, I'm a big proponent of outer course, so like, kind of like,
Go ahead and take another 2 minutes, wrap up.
And then, well, maybe what.
These are just small.
Doing great.
We can't just tell people to like not do something.
See, that just came out so fast.
Oh, thank you.
Providing the experience of what.
Oh, sure, thanks for being
Maybe
here.
not those much.
Oh, yeah.
So if you have a culture that, where you're not supposed to be touched at all, what can you do? Yeah. I have a 2-year-old, so I don't want to be touched right now. Give me a few years when she's off my legs. When I was raising my kids, anybody. I used to love her, like when we were
Oh, thank you.
like we would like seriously like go to sleep every night, it was great. And
Okay, if you want to go ahead and recentering our discussion. So we have about 15 more minutes, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right? Till 45? Okay. So we have 3 main scenarios that we're going to go through. And so I thought we are probably going to spend a little less time on it than we normally would, but we'll get to all of them in this time, and then we'll shorten our Q&A afterwards. So who had scenario 1? Would you like to read it for us?
Sure. A generally conservative Catholic parish approaches you to address an issue of bullying in their community. The kindergarten through 8th grade school associated with the parish has been having a problem with gay students being bullied and beat up, especially during recess. They want you to work with both the parents and the students in your intervention. What questions do you ask upon the initial request, and how might this guide your intervention?
Right. So what'd y'all come up with?
Oh, okay, I thought we were all gonna jump in, sorry. So we were talking about, meeting the clients as in the school where they're at, asking, where they stand on this issue, because there's only so much you can do if, the system in itself is still against something. Asking if what they've done already, like, are you calling us because this is like, it just started? Are you calling us because like, there's news coverage? Are you calling like, that kind of stuff? And,
The policy, we talked about
Yeah.
asking them about whether or not they have, anti-bullying policies and whether or not those policies include sexual orientation, to see whether or not they've tried to address this before or prioritize it.
and then, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, and talking about how bullying is kind of a PC word for other stuff like sexism and racism and
Sometimes sexual harassment. Right. Absolutely. Thoughts from anyone else?
I would just think, I'd be curious to know what they see the end result being. Like, what would count as a solution to the situation? Because if they're conservative and they practice that conservatism, I would want to know that their idea of a solution isn't about, well, gay students just not being gay, right? Or them just not being in our school or whatever it is. Like, so I would know for myself if I can really address that. So I would ask.
That's brilliant, is the idea of what is a solution for you. Because in some conservative Christian congregations, the solution is to fix the gays. Have them not be gay anymore, and then this problem is gone. And then that's it. So yeah, definitely asking, like, what is that about? Did you all talk about the power structure at all? And like, how that worked into this scenario?
It talks about like, how do you want us to talk to, is it like the parents of the kids who are being bullied and them, or like the kids who are doing the bullying? Like, is this all together at once with them? Like how? I don't know if that really answers that.
Yeah, that's definitely a dynamic to take. Are we doing both talking with parents and youth at the same time? Because talking about some sexual things with your mom sitting right there might be a little less comfortable than like, oh, it's me and my bullying friends. Oh, and that's how we're supposed to learn about this. Right, that's definitely going to impact the intervention as well. Good. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay. Our second scenario.
Yes, we got that. Our scenario was a Muslim community center is seeking information about the multiplicity of the aspects of sexuality. The teens in the community have been curious and are open to learning with many questions. The parents are more conservative than their children. There's been a recent rise in STI diagnoses in the larger community as well. How do you navigate this?
And what did y'all come up with?
We discussed going to the parents first.
And really just having a conversation with the parents about what their thoughts and feelings are and where, like, what's been going on in the larger community and how they think it's impacting their kids and how they think it's impacting themselves, and like presenting them with facts and things and really establishing our own credibility is like, look, we can talk about this and not have it interrupt your faith or like be against what you believe in your values and still get your kids' questions answered kind of
imposing any sort of values, like the value teaching
to them,
to you.
and really creating a partnership with the parents such that we can then go in and have conversations with the teens, have their questions answered, and then be able to send them back to their parents who then at that point also have more information and can deal with the value concerns.
So navigating and having a clear distinction between values and health information and the different things that we're going to have to talk about. Okay. Other thoughts?
So this is not to validate what's been said. I would definitely refer to one of my Muslim colleagues if I had that option. And if I don't have that option, I'm questioning why I don't have that option. Because it is a whole way of thinking and being it's like a whole culture that I'm not part of. And I would feel really uncomfortable being asked, like, it'd be flattering to be asked, but it's like what Feminista was saying, you know, it's not my place. I didn't feel it's my place to be that person. So I don't think I could offer the best solutions, because I think the solutions would be very intertwined with the cultural fabric of that community. And I don't know that fabric. I'm not made of that same fabric. And so, you know, there's a limited scope. There's a very limited scope of what I can offer. If I'm the only one and whatever, and I have that limited scope, I'm going in with that limited scope and knowing that that's great or not, right? Like, what is health, right? Like, halal is a thing, right? There's a whole, we have a colleague, Smelly just walked in. We have a colleague who it was last year, did a workshop on, she did a workshop on halal sex toys.
No, it's economics.
But she's also into it. Anyway, this concept I had never even thought of, because I'm not halal, and it's not affect my daily life, right? Like, the idea of you're consuming something, if you're putting it in your body, you're on your body, and, you know, I don't even know, it's like, I get confused about how is a sex toy vegan or not, you know, but like, people who are vegan understand it very well, and it's like, being flippant upon me, right? Anyway, so that's what comes to mind when I see this scenario. It's like, you know, and barring that, I would want to get to know the community. If they've invited me, if they truly want me there, I would want to build a relationship with the parents. Build a relationship that's not centered around me trying to get my agenda done, right? It's like, I have no agenda. I'm there, my agenda is to be useful to the extent that I can be, and to how you want me, based on what I've been asked to do. Exactly.
That's a brilliant concept that you're bringing up, is that sometimes, and this is what we're often taught, is that there's values and then there's, you know, health stuff. And sometimes those are not different. And in some communities, we actually have to consider that, well, our values are so closely tied with the health stuff that that doesn't matter. Halal is a great example. Kosher is another example. Different Jewish communities follow kosher laws differently. But absolutely, and finding a colleague and then questioning that, because that's a fantastic idea if one doesn't have a Muslim colleague, and identifying what is it that makes me not the best candidate here, and then maybe focusing in specifically on that, and the way going about that. Fantastic, thanks.
So I thought about that, but I'm thinking about it in a little different way. Mm-hmm. Because the first thing I thought of was, who's running this Muslim community center? Because if it's the Muslim people and they know enough to ask me, then I kind of feel like, okay, I can trust that. Mm-hmm. Now, not every community center is run by the people in that community. So if it's not run by Muslim folks, then I'm really gonna be like, nah, because you just reached out to whoever you reach out to. Mm-hmm. But in the case that it's run by Muslim people and they know I'm not Muslim and they're like, come in, and I'm, okay, you tell me what you need me to do because you know who I am. Mm-hmm. So in that case, I think I would be open, and I probably would be much more like, tell me what you want me to do. Here's what I have. Tell me what you want me to be in this space. Owe me, however, and we'll make this happen if you really see something in me that you don't see in somebody else. So in that case, I think I would be much more open. And then I also had a moment where I thought about, well, I don't know that I would feel as strongly concerned if these were Black Muslims. Because for me, it's like, Black trumps everything. So, hey y'all, I'm coming in, you know, let's make it happen. And at the same time, I think about it, I'm like, I don't know if that's necessarily your right perspective either. Mm-hmm. So.
Black sexuality and Muslim sexuality. And in which ways do those interact, especially here in the US?
Especially here in Philly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Muslims are like, out of like South Asian, like Arab populations, are generally more political. Yeah. Are generally politicized. Mm-hmm. They're hip to more topics.
Hip to topics. Great, let's get through that last one before the end of the concept. You both had them. Would one of you like to read?
I'll go. Okay. A local faith group approaches you for a workshop on sex and safety. They request that you do not discuss condoms in any presentation material.
What do you do? And does this change depending on the faith group?
Right. What'd you all come up with? What'd you talk about? This one is specifically open and kind of vague because it's not so much about the faith community and what tradition it is, as much as what happens to us as change makers when we're met with the concept of you have to do something that is not necessarily in line with your values. How do we address that?
We talked a couple of things. I mean, first we just asked general questions. We thought our answer might change based on this, whether it was who we were speaking with, who we were close to, was it to adolescents, was it to adults, is it to partner couples? Also, what do they mean by sex? What do they mean by safety specifically? Is it more of an emotional thing? Is it STI? Is it pregnancy? Is it kink? All of those things. And then what is sex? And so based on what those answers might be, would be maybe that it might not be something that I would be comfortable doing because I would be more in line with wanting to give people options and then choosing, and one of those options would be condoms. And then from that, having them make the decisions that's best for them, but not prescribing them.
Just like STIs and health and values, the concept of safety and values can also be something that is very intertwined in faiths, or not. Other group, did you come up with anything else, anything different?
Outside of that discussion.
I was kind of thinking that I was kind of going the route of what else could I teach that doesn't have anything to do with condoms. And that's where I would, like in terms of what would you do, I would probably do it and I would not compromise talking about condoms because if I say no, who is going to teach it and what are they going to be teaching? Is it going to be shame-based? And I'm interested in this, if it's absence-only curriculum, how can you still make that sex positive without crossing boundaries? But as an educator, I could probably still be able to get a point across of thinking about safety and critical thinking and responsibility without talking about condoms.
Healthy relationship communication skills.
Right, or other sexual behaviors, or like what does it mean to be, like you're saying, defining terms, and then they can kind of find out what that means to them to be safe without me telling them that condoms mean safe.
Right. One of the other things, if we had a little more time, is I would ask about what else might be inconsistent with your values. What might be other barriers that communities bring up that ask about those? So think about those for yourself. If you want to tell me afterwards, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to write it in the little evaluations. But wrapping up, because I'm going to tell you what I already told you. BuzzFeed has a fantastic way of getting around, so I was like, well, let's BuzzFeedify this article. Talk about who's in charge. Notice the climate of sexuality. What's going on there? What do they think sexuality is for? How does that impact the way they have taught about it? The faith history, how does that impact the way that they have taught about sexuality and the way that they view maybe accepting help from people who are not members of that faith community or are? The motivations for the training, why they want you there. What are you doing? Clarifying, what do you see as success of what's going on here? And then finally, proceed with religious cultural competence. Be aware that when it's a religion, there's different cultures within that specific religion. This is why we have many different sects of religion. When you're at Widener, you have to be very clear to pronounce that T. And you want to just be very clear about where your identities lack, because that is something that will happen when it comes to cultural competence, and that's fine. You just got to address it and pay a little more attention to it. So that, I believe, concludes at 3:44 our presentation. If you have a question in a minute. This one? Oh, the other one? Yeah. So yeah, if you have any thoughts or questions, you can contact me. My emails are always changing, so there's a website that has a contact form, just myname.com, and you can go to it and check it out. Any other thoughts or questions? You can stay after. I'd love to talk. Thanks, everyone. Yes, what's up?
One thing I just wanted to a little conflicting with you, and it's just like, we were talking about
Calling.
Paul wanted to make sure it was an early Christian, but,
Right.
and so, yes, it was